And this session is on ITAR. And you'll wonder why. And very often, organizations that handle DoD, controlled unclassified information, also have export control and ITAR information with them. And instead of deploying point solutions and handling each compliance framework separately, it can be helpful to address all compliance mandates in an integrated fashion, since there is significant overlap between them. So this session will introduce you to ITAR regulations. And just a second here, I am going to, sorry. Just 1 second. Sorry, I've been jumping between sessions over here. So let me pull up my presentation over here and share it with you. Okay. Here we go. So we have put together a panel over here that is going to introduce you to new regulations in ITAR that are called 120.54, often referred to as the end-to-end encryption carve-out, and how that can not only simplify your ITAR compliance, but the very same end-to-end encrypted systems can also then help you achieve CMMC and NIST 800 compliance. So with us are two experts in this session over here. We have Matt Henson, who's a principal at Global Trade Solutions. He's a trade compliance professional and has spent his entire career working at the intersection of global commerce, export regulations, and information technology. He specializes in the automation of trade compliance processes and controls, with a focus on identification, control, and tracking of regulated information. He has a depth, and I mean a depth of understanding of ITAR and end-to-end encryption. So we will be hearing from him. And also joining us is Alexander Major. Alex is a partner and co-chair of the government contracts and global trade practice in the law firm of McCarter English. He's a former U.S. Air Force intelligence officer and a federal procurement and cybersecurity authority. Consistent with my earlier remarks, he not only counsels companies of all sizes on issues relating to ITAR, but also on NIST, FIPS, FedRAMP, and DFARS, and furthermore conducts investigations to assist companies to ensure that they are in full compliance. So we will be actually doing a few presentations and then asking a few questions. So let me set the stage. We have talked about this new ITAR regulation called 120.54. What is this and what is this end-to-end encryption? So what's nice is that those of you that have been doing ITAR had probably put together sort of complex, in-house systems, on-premise systems, and used a hodgepodge of software to try to put this thing together. But 2 years ago, the State Department came up with new regulations that are really simple to follow and allowed you to basically send, store, and share ITAR data, provided it does just three things. The data must be secured using end-to-end encryption. Second, the encryption techniques must be using FIPS 140-2 or its successors. And third, the means of decryption under no circumstances are to be provided to third parties, including cloud providers such as PreVeil. So I want to set the stage by first explaining what is this end-to-end encryption. So you're used to often with this notion of encryption in transit and at rest. And what that simply means is when you send an email, as an example, it gets encrypted in transit to this mail server, encrypted again while it goes to the recipient, company's mail servers, and often it is encrypted at rest on the mail servers. But what's important to understand is that the mail servers decrypt that information and can look at it, and that's a security vulnerability, but doesn't fit the definition of what's called end-to-end encryption. So what is end-to-end encryption? It is subtly, but very, very radically different from encryption in transit and rest. And here's what happens. In end-to-end encryption, you send an email, it's encrypted by the sending company, it remains encrypted on cloud servers and can only be decrypted by the recipient. So now on the cloud servers, unlike encryption in transit and at rest, you cannot have that information decrypted ever, including by the cloud server. And under 120.54, the encryption must be done using FIPS 140-2. So the benefits are there's a lot of cloud services, PreVeil being one of them, that allow you to now say, hey, I'll just overlay my system with an encrypted email system that works with my email, whether it be O365 or G Suite, works with my existing, file systems. And now I can just overlay it quickly. It allows me to achieve ITAR compliance. It reduces the cost and enhances security to the gold standard of end-to-end encryption and zero trust. So I wanted to just set the foundation for what is end-to-end encryption, but now I'm going to hand it over to Matt Henson to take it over and share how compliance works at more detail using 120.54 in its totality. So over to you, Matt.
Awesome. Thanks, Sanjeev. Let me go ahead and get this full screen here. I've set a timer, Alex, to make sure I don't go over and respect what you had to say today. So part of the presentation, I'm just going to cover a term that you may not have heard before called export controlled information. We'll briefly explain that. We're going to talk about something I call DID compliance debt, and then cyber compliance requirements in a nutshell, and specifically wrapping up with the ECI encryption use case, certainly an extremely strong use case that I see for encryption. So when I refer to the term ECI, it's a country regime agnostic way of referring to any country's or data that's subject to export controls. Be ITAR, could be EAR, could be MEDI, could be SCOMAT, any country's information. And in general, it's information required for design, development, production, manufacturing, assembly, test, operation, maintenance, repair, etc. And of course, nuances do apply between the countries, but that's essentially what we're talking about from a U.S. export compliance perspective when referring to the regulated data. We also have overlap with the CUI. I've got my animation out of whack here, but certainly if you look at the definitions of CTI, EXPT, and EXPTR, basically directly overlap with these definitions of ECI. Not all ECI is CUI, not all CUI is ECI, but there is an area certainly of overlap that we need to be aware of. And certainly as compliance professionals and security professionals, we need to be able to exploit this overlap in the joint use case. So DID compliance debt. If we look across the defense industrial base, there is a level of compliance debt, and it stems from what I refer to as the known unknowns. We have unknown data and unknown data storage locations, potentially accessible by unknown users, where actual access is unknown. This is, if you look at the 2018 FLIR consent agreement, this is what burned FLIR. And then we have unknown transfers of unknown data to unknown users and unknown retransfers of unknown data to unknown users. This is what burned Honeywell and got them their 2021 consent agreement. If we look at this and drill down more specifically on the export compliance use case, any compliance program worth its weight in salt has this capability, which is capabilities to classify and control at time of export shipment. And the regulations being written in the 70s really focus on this type of risk. So risk in the physical domain, physical access to product, physical transfers of products. But in today's world, we have to ask ourselves, what about all the information being exchanged with our customers and suppliers beforehand? Moreover, what about all the data being exchanged internally? And what we see with the known unknowns is the bottom line, the defense industrial base has to implement capabilities to identify, control, track, and remediate ECI. But from an identification perspective, we have to be able to tag and mark this information for safeguarding and compliant release. And control, tracking, remediation, we're talking about location, access, and transfers. And essentially, these are the capabilities required to safeguard and compliantly release ECI. And I would argue the same is true on the ECI or the CUI side as well, which brings me to the DIB cyber compliance requirements in a nutshell. So if we look at CMMC and the CUI flow downs, this is essentially how it works. You get a contract that has a flow down requirement. You now have the CUI information that you have to be able to protect the confidentiality of and safeguard that data. And then those requirements flow down throughout the supply chain. Well, these requirements have applied in a very similar fashion to ECI for decades. And if we look at these requirements, neither is optional, and they have the same challenges, which are capabilities to safeguard and compliantly release the information. And what we'll find is that we can use the same solutions to address both use cases. And those are essentially solutions to identify our data, know its location, access, transfer, to be able to track that information, and to be able to remediate it. And these are really the security protection assets that we spoke of previously. So certainly if you're a CUI practitioner and you're trying to get support for budget, you need to be looking at the ECI use case. Companies are getting hammered today. They're getting major fines and having to spend a lot of money to mitigate ECI. So this is certainly a use case you should look at to strengthen your business proposition to leadership. So from an encryption standpoint, I won't cover 12054. Sanjeev did a great job doing that. But when we look at the encryption use case, I really love the encryption use case for the data transfers, for anything that's leaving your security boundary. That information, again, gets decrypted, and then you can control who accesses that information based on those encryption policies, right? So you can control the transfer and exports of that information. And you can also control the retransfers and re-export of the information. Now, one thing to, cover benefits first here. So the benefits are extend compliant release controls and safeguarding controls for that matter. TCI that leaves your security boundary. You're going to be able to record all events, which will support your compliant record keeping requirements. You can report all events and notify of high risk events. All right. So if you have someone, for example, someone's trying to access and decrypt that information from China, you can see that. You can revoke access privileges after that information goes out. And you can also disprove release or a term in trade compliance law that's referred to as potential access. You can actually prove that users did not, read that information, which is really, really important from a risk mitigation perspective when we're looking at potential spills and disclosure activity. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this type of approach, if you're working and using this encryption capability under an ITAR agreement, if you're provisioning your sub-licensees, so folks who are not signatories to the agreement, if the US exporter is actually doing that, this is against the official ITAR agreement guidelines and viewed as a violation from the State Department. And so you have to have capabilities like this, so capabilities to push that provisioning out to your signatory, who is then authorized to affect those retransfers and re-exports. So just a quick tip there as you're looking to leverage these end-to-end encryption solutions for your environment. One thing to touch on real quick here, end-to-end encryption requirement absolutely spelled out explicitly within the ITAR. So if you're using solutions like MIP for the trade compliance use case, it is not end-to-end encryption, right? So that's something to be aware of. And also, if your solution is not FIPS 140-2, you may be fine if you're using the equivalent from, say, an ITAR perspective, right? But if that information is also CUI, you fail to meet the FIPS 140-2 validated requirement, and you're going to have issues on the CUI side. So certainly leveraging a solution that's FIPS validated can help mitigate compliance risk on both the ITAR and EAR or CUI side. All right, Alex,
Well,
I believe I'm under my 10 minutes here. I'll turn things over to you.
thank you very much. So I think, again, you brought up excellent points on, look, you got to ensure that both parties are, signatories to the agreements. But what's nice about end-to-end encryption is once you got that in place, you can maintain control of the information because it's going encrypted end-to-end. And systems such as what we provide can further ring fence it only to authorized users and have capabilities to recall information or share it for a limited time basis. But overall, what's nice is that the use of systems like TC engines in conjunction with end-to-end encryption can radically simplify and strengthen both your data security and compliance regime. So with that, we're going to go and hand over to Alex for his remarks on how he sees compliance. And over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev, and great job, Matt. Thank you. I'm going to dovetail on what you just said, Sanjeev, in terms of simplicity, because one of the things, and I don't have slides, so just this face. But one of the things that was said is we're using the word simplify a lot, and I think that's super important here, because one of the things that I guess you have the benefit of in ITAR that you don't necessarily have the benefit of with CUI is the fact that the Department of Defense really isn't good with marking their CUI. ITAR has been around for years. They're pretty good at doing that. So you'll know what's ITAR, what's not ITAR. CUI, on the other hand, there is a lot of conversation about the marking of CUI. Is it marked properly? Is it marked incorrectly? Is it marked at all? Whenever I talk about it, I always ask, like, who's seen CUI markings? Chances are you've seen them, and they've probably been incorrect. We're still seeing FOUO, for example. But the problem with that, and the reason I raise that, is because having an end-to-end encryption technology makes it sort of simple. If you know that what you're getting is going to be held and or moved or redirected through that process, it provides a little bit more assurance that stuff that the government might find out later or decide later is CUI is actually being handled in the appropriate way, or can be easily moved to be handled in an appropriate way. And the reason that's important, as Matt indicated, is because you are under a couple of different obligations to do that. So specifically, end-to-end encryption is required. 140-2 encryption is going to be required for elements under 171 for access control, identification and authorization, media protection, and system and communications protections, right? So there are requirements currently in your contract, specifically under DFARS 252-7012, thereby accumulating all the NIST 800-171 requirements that direct that. The reason that's an issue, the reason that's important, is because A, it's in your contract, right? We just talked about that. It's going to be flown down in a number of different ways, but also you're also being graded against that with the clauses at -7019 and -7020, right? You have to say, you have to confirm, and soon the government will be coming by and checking your math, literally, if and when and how you are meeting those requirements. So that's super important to know. Are you doing it? Are you able to do it? If you're not doing it, how can you get to there? Those are all important elements of being 171 or being compliant with 7012 and making sure that you're meeting the adequate security requirements. And if you've heard me talk about adequate security, you realize that is a much larger pool than just 800-171. What is fascinating about encryption is if you currently look at, and again, I'm always hesitant to start talking about CMMC, but you'll see that encryption is identified. They've released 2 of the assessment guides, and you'll see that encryption is identified at least 4 times in the CMMC level 2. So having that ability and being able to do it and use it and function with it is imperative, because A, you need it now under your contracts if you're a defense contractor dealing with covered defense information. But within the next year, give or take, you're going to need to be able to pivot to also be able to do this under CMMC level 2. And you don't want this, especially when it's something that is readily simple to get and able to maintain. You don't want this to be the thing holding you back from getting to level 2. So that's critical. The only the last thing I'll say is just as a reminder, and Sanjeev kind of went over this, is remember that when we're talking end-to-end encryption, in order to ensure that level of security, the required level of security, and to meet the ITAR requirements of end-to-end encryption to allow for that carve out, it's critical. It's critical that the means of decrypting the data, meaning the actual key, right? That's the encryption, is that key, must not have been provided to or stored by any third party. Right. So that includes your ISP, your server hosting service, or your cloud provider. So as you're looking at solutions, make sure that that's part of it, because that is that's literally the secret sauce. And making sure that you have encryption that is not only viable and reliable and simple, but also that allows you to meet the requirements that DDTC and ITAR and EAR and CUI requires, is going to be imperative. Otherwise, you're just throwing good money after bad.
Those are excellent points, and I want to sort of reinforce a few things. Number one, modern solutions such as ours absolutely are designed from the grounds up to ensure that we never, ever have any capability to decrypt the information, because if we have any remote capability to decrypt it, it renders ITAR, basically non-compliant. And it essentially also weakens security greatly. So that's point number one. Point number two, I think, as you and Matt mentioned, it is important to have that as validated encryption, because not only will you be using it for ITAR, but you'll be also using it for FIPS 140-2. So having that encryption, end-to-end encryption scheme being fully validated is equally important. And then the third point I want to mention over here is that for folks that are listening to this for the first time, what we are saying, even though we are saying simple, may seem intimidating. We'll say, oh my God, there's a lot of jargon over here. What's this FIPS and end-to-end encryption and so forth? And what I emphasize over here, that when you use such systems, you'll find that, yes, all this is complex, but it's buried into the systems which are ultimately really, really quite simple to use. For example, if you're using email with PreVeil, you're just sending it from your Outlook or from your Gmail. If you're using file sharing, it's like a Dropbox or Google. And the argument that I would also make on the simplicity of end-to-end encryption is one of those most ironical ones, that the world's consumers today use end-to-end encryption with the ITAR clauses in billions today. So there are two services that I want to refer to, which is WhatsApp and Signal. And yes, they may not be FIPS 140-2, but they are fully end-to-end encrypted. And that's how simple they are. For a consumer, basically, they're communicating with their counterparts with a fully end-to-end encrypted system where the cloud provider doesn't have access to the key. And so if they had implemented it with FIPS 140-2, et cetera, believe it or not, such systems would be, bordering compliance for at least, ITAR. So I wanted to kind of raise that. I want to conclude this by asking both of you one question each. You mentioned the consequences of non-compliance, and you assumed everybody knew about the Honeywell story, but I'd like you to speak to it and see what are the consequences. That's one. And the second question is, speak to the challenges that are particularly faced by small to medium businesses in ensuring compliance with ITAR, but also with 800-171 as well. And those will be our concluding questions for this session. . 。 So maybe Matt,
Okay.
you answered the question on
Yeah,
the consequences of non-compliance. So
I'll fill the consent agreement. So I've worked 6 of them, all in this kind of space around how to identify, control, and track information. What we're seeing is a trend in the consent agreement. So whenever you violate the ITAR and it's egregious, or you get multiple repeat violations for what appears to the government to be the same thing, you're heading down the path to getting a consent agreement. The consent agreement comes with a bunch of proposed charges that if it moves from a civil, so if you choose to fight it, they will recommend you to the DOJ and get the FBI involved, and that's when you start getting at risk of yellow jumpsuits, or orange jumpsuits, right? So typically, what we'll see in consent agreements is a fine. That fine can be relatively small for the small companies, not small to them, but small relatively, and it can range all the way up to, the tens, the 50s, the hundreds of millions of dollars for violations. And typically what you'll see in a consent agreement is the remedial measures will, I'll say, quadruple the fine cost. So if you see a $30 million fine, rest assured that company is going to invest about $120 million to go out and do a bunch of stuff that the government's telling them that they have to do that may or may not fix the problem. And so you certainly want to be proactive and avoid those types of consent agreements. Specifically, what happened to Honeywell was they had information going through the supply chain that was routed through a country in Europe and ended up in China. And it happened multiple times, and it was for a very sensitive program and technology. And that's what got Honeywell their consent agreement. I believe their consent agreement was $30 to $40 million fine, I believe is the number.
well, those are big numbers, and certainly we know that if you are hit with one of them, Alex would be happy to defend you, but that is not an inexpensive undertaking in of itself. So with that, we will, in order to be on time for the next session, thank you both, Alex, as well as Matt, for your insightful comments and for introducing, I think, to the majority of the folks on this session for the first time, this new technology and technique to go and comply with, not just ITAR, but 800-171 and soon CMMC. And all 3 of us would be happy to address, further questions. Don't hesitate to reach out to info@preveil.com. And if there are questions for Matt or Alex, we will be happy to direct your communication to them. Thank you very much again for joining us. And over to the next and last session for the day. Noel, take it over.